This video is sponsored by Aura. As he does, Harmony Korine recently remarked on the dethroning of cinema as the dominant art form by newer media like video games and streaming, which foster an environment for creative young minds to experiment and flourish where cinematic tradition would otherwise stifle them. This is a gong he's been hitting for a while now, but one can't help but hear it ring while watching Coralie Farjah's new film, The Substance, a sort of spy versus spy narrative about two generations refusing to reconcile with each other's existence. While the actual text of The Substance has little to do with Korine's sentiment regarding art, more focused on industry politics, and if anything coming to the opposite conclusion with regards to the young versus the old, I believe it's in the film's form where Farjah, knowingly or not, demonstrates these two battling instincts. It's a duel between younger and older artistic sensibilities competing for authority over the film's body until it ultimately destroys itself. Farjah's film, which follows Demi Moore as a washed-up actress and daytime TV jazzercise instructor who's gifted an opportunity to spend half her time as a younger woman, wastes no time establishing an absurd, satirical world. Long before an inkling of its sci-fi premise is introduced, we are inundated with the funhouse mirror logic the film operates under. We open on a montage tracking the life cycle of Moore's Hollywood Walk of Fame star, and right off the bat, the name Elizabeth Sparkle serves as a disclaimer not to take anything that happens over the next 140 minutes too seriously. The tone is closest to that of an Adult Swim special, where normal human behavior is not to be expected. We watch the concrete star wither and decay, develop cracks and wrinkles, and fall out of public favor, communicating the arc of its organic counterpart. People walking over the star express their disinterest through increasingly heavy-handed dialogue, and the sequence culminates in a man dropping a hamburger on it and trying to wipe up the sauce with his shoe, ultimately just smearing it and giving up. Like the comically direct dialogue, the sound mixing of this moment is abrasive and telegraphs the kind of sensory experience we're in for, with ASMR levels of EQ maxing so that each condiment slosh tickles every crevice of our ear canals. When we finally leave the fixed perspective of the sidewalk and begin to follow Elizabeth herself, this flooding of the senses continues into her day-to-day. Farjah frames sequences with extreme wide lenses positioned right up to the actors' faces, set to breakneck cutting rhythms. We only linger on a wide shot when there's so much movement in the frame that we need some sort of anchoring to appreciate the ballistic blocking, because, again, everyone bounces around like a cartoon character. The primary face of this extremism is Dennis Quaid, who's doing an off-the-wall Ray Liotta impression as Elizabeth's sexually aggressive executive producer, Harvey. Again, subtlety was never the mission here. Liotta was originally cast in the role, and I'm sad we couldn't see that version of the film, but Quaid steps up to the task, flashing orange teeth as he screams nearly every line delivery. An early scene sees him sucking down shrimp with such volumetric force that it makes the opener's hamburger spill feel like slow cinema. And I'll remind you, this is all before anything bizarre happens in the plot, before any elements of body horror even begin. This is the normal world of the film. In other words, through Farjah's eyes, the world is already grotesque and horrific. So imagine how much worse things get when she actually initiates the science fiction. The catalyst of this change comes in the form of the titular substance, which Elizabeth injects to initiate the birth of her younger body, played by Margaret Qualley. Qualley's avatar takes on the moniker of Sue, so that she's able to do all the same things Elizabeth used to do without anyone realizing it's sort of her, and an increasingly rubbery floating camera and industrial techno score carry us through her acclimation to Elizabeth's world. She takes over hosting the jazzercise show after Elizabeth is fired and brings a youthful spin to the program. She parties hard and often, she begins to populate more and more screens and billboards and magazines, she becomes a star again. And of course, she gets greedy and begins to overindulge on the resources from her original body to maintain the younger self, against the substance's very explicit rules. The outline that she is to spend 7 days in the young body at a time, fueling herself with a daily dose of spinal fluid from the original body, then another 7 days in the old body, and to continue this cycle without digression forever. Sue's inevitable deviation from these rules ignites a feud between the two bodies that only grows more and more violent as Sue's antics and excessive spinal tapping suck the life force out of Elizabeth, whose body consequently begins to take on the physiognomy of a haggard witch. In retaliation to this, and to Sue's excessive partying, Elizabeth begins to spend her allotted conscious hours engorging on anything she can stuff in her figurative cauldron. A recipe for foie gras telegraphs this mutual overindulgence. It's not long before Sue's body begins to bear the burden of this rule-breaking as well, and the two initiate all-out warfare with each other. This is the spy versus spy I mentioned, and as both bodies deteriorate, the film gets its mileage out of what can only be described as an evil checklist of ASMR nightmares: skin mutation, teeth pulling, nail pulling, giant syringes, giant stitches, pus, gore, things coming out of orifices, and general bodily entropy. In other words, Dr. Pimple Popper cinema. Each violent act against the body employs a gleeful cruelty only previously seen by the Splinter episode of SpongeBob, all shown in extreme close-up with that signature, graphically squishy sound design. This kind of maximalist sensory overload on paper sounds like exactly what Kareen and his edgelord project are hoping to cultivate among the youth operating in other media. Where filmmakers are so beholden to save the cat story structure, he's crying out for artists to create more experience-forward work. So in theory, the substance should be an antidote to the homogeneity currently populating mainstream cinema. But to Kareen's point, it strikes me as counterintuitive that such formal extremism Farjah manages to achieve here is put in service of such a conventional, traditionally structured screenplay. The substance, for all its visual prowess, moving in long stretches with no dialogue and communicating much of the story non-verbally, ultimately never strays from hero's journey narrative box ticking. Here's a little graphic I put together, and I get the idea that the hero's journey is basically universal and should apply to any story, but it took surprisingly little bending to get the substance's story beats to fit the Joseph Conrad framework, even some of the more specific and antiquated steps. As soon as the rules of the substance are laid out, we know exactly what the story is going to turn into, and it never strays from that early telegraphed narrative about getting greedier and greedier with diminishing returns. Oh, if she had only followed the rules, if she had only respected the balance. In all fairness, to call the movie predictable is about as useful as calling the dialogue on the nose. Farjah doesn't seem to be under any sort of illusion that she's taking us through twists and turns we never saw coming. Her approach is more so to beat us over the head with inevitability, to hammer away a point so impossible to miss that there's nothing else to do but repeat it over and over again. The theme of the film is very simple. Society, especially the entertainment industry, is afraid of aging, and women who no longer bear the epidermal polish of a child are cast aside so the industry can keep projecting this idea of what a woman should look like. As a result, women are taught to self-loathe after a certain age and tear themselves apart for it, be that by actively injuring themselves or by succumbing to rapidly accelerating cosmetic technology. This is communicated full stop by the end of that opening sequence with the Walk of Fame star, and the rest of the movie is essentially just tapping the sign. The blunt force trauma of repeating this point with such ferocity is certainly Farjah's intent, but I often find the nearsightedness of it frustrating. Even in her intentionally myopic, abstract world, there are several opportunities for smaller ruminations on other aspects of our day-to-day life. One of my favorite details of the film is the resemblance between the box the substance originally arrives in and your average HelloFresh box. Like HelloFresh, the substance box contains exactly as much resource as Elizabeth needs for the week, no more, no less, and it comes with minimal instruction, which Sue figures out how to use with absurd intuition. In the same way David Fincher's The Killer uses the veneer of an action thriller to serve as a secret, broader critique of digital, contact-free services and the gig economy, this detail of the substance evoking HelloFresh seems to be targeting subscription models and the everything-as-a-service economy, which the beauty industry certainly exploits. And on that note, this video is sponsored by, you guessed it, Aura Cybersecurity. Are you sick of leaky data? Afraid of joining the 2.9 billion records that were stolen from national public data? That's right, hackers may have stolen the social security number of every American and posted it online for free access. If you somehow feel exempt from this privacy violation, then maybe you're just gosh darn tired of receiving spam calls, texts, and phishing scams at every waking hour. And if any of the above is the case, then boy do I have the service for you. Aura is your cybersecurity bodyguard, offering a VPN, transaction monitoring, antivirus protection, a password manager, parental controls, and identity theft insurance. They have an AI call assistant to vet all the other AI bots programmed to call you, and it filters out spam and phishing texts so that you don't find yourself in a situation where a younger, hotter version of you is going around exploiting your identity. I have Aura set up to regularly assess the security of my stuff, and every update letting me know my existence hasn't been compromised is a breath of fresh air. I can sleep at night with the knowledge that they will give me up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario happen. You too can experience this sense of safety by going to aura.com/TaylorJWilliams and trying your first 2 weeks for free. Also linked below in the description. Check out Aura. Today. Right now. In 15-20 minutes. To take the everything as a service idea further, and on the subject of paid sponsorship while we're at it, the stratified existences of Elizabeth and Sue seem to suggest a capitalist allegory going on here, in which the privileged body is free to gallivant only at the cost of an exploited body, which is unsustainably leached off of at an exponential rate until both collapse. It's hammered away more times than you can count that Moore's Elizabeth is the original body, and thus has the power to realize her authority against the dominant body. These reminders are delivered with a gravity that evokes rhetoric about the working class as the majority body of a given capitalist society, and Elizabeth's spinal fluid seems to represent the means of production being controlled by the privileged body. Thus, the movie illustrates a sort of class warfare within the self. One would be remiss not to point out that the procedure is itself the product of uber privilege from a Hollywood millionaire, and that Elizabeth is given and frequently reminded of the option to stop at any point. It's seemingly her vanity that keeps her going on the procedure, so she seemingly has the agency to not exploit herself. But that vanity is the product of a system that devalues her for simply experiencing time as a mortal human being. She has the ability to live out the rest of her life more than comfortably, but what she has in troves in financial capital, she's lacking in social capital. And the film is largely communicating the mindset of someone made to believe that this is the only option she has in a society that no longer values her. This is all well and good, but I think the bigger takeaway here is that this relationship only goes one way. Farjah's taking an opportunity to extend the film's commentary outward, to give it a universal quality and reveal insights about things far beyond its literal scope, and instead opting to use existing real-world conflicts to channel their ethos back inward and rinse and repeat the same original point. Now, the kind of shallow class commentary I just outlined is admittedly low-hanging fruit at this point for elevated horror, so I should be glad that Farjah doesn't default to that as her overarching subject matter here. But the act of channeling everything inward is indicative of where her priorities lie. I think a more specific through line than late capitalism connecting the subject matter of the killer and the substance is the lack of mediation, a concept whose impact on the aesthetics of various media Anna Kornblue writes about in her book Immediacy. She argues that, parallel to modern production and circulation being increasingly streamlined in the digital age and cutting out the middleman at every given opportunity, the smearing of medium lines in art has largely fostered an onslaught of formless, overstimulating performance art. Her primary example is the immersive Van Gogh experience, which offers a hot yoga class surrounded by 3D Van Gogh visualizations, in which the boundaries of painting and cinema and music and exercise and temperature between absorbing art and performing are all erased in service of total, full-body experience. Sensory overload. At a glance, this seems to describe what Kareen argues is form-pushing and revolutionary, experiential art. I'm sure he thinks immersive Van Gogh specifically is lame, as he should, but I think at the very least, Edgelord operates with a similar interest in immersion and line smearing. As for the substance, this idea applies to the HelloFresh of it all, which itself eliminates the mediation of grocery shopping, but that formless, overstimulating monstrosity Kornblue illustrates is also a pretty accurate way to describe the part Elizabeth, part Sue, borderless abomination Quallian Moore's characters turn into by the end of the film. This isn't the case initially. When Sue is first birthed, it takes us a while to realize that she and Elizabeth have separate consciousnesses. It's not until Elizabeth wakes back up and sees what she's done as Sue that we realize that more than just a different body, this is a completely different person acting with her DNA. In other words, there is hard-defined mediation going on here. This initially leads one to wonder what Elizabeth even gets out of the dynamic. It's not her doing these things. No one thinks it's her because Sue is a different identity than Elizabeth. She doesn't experience any of the fun stuff herself, and she eventually starts to resent Sue for everything. It's just the voice behind the substance that reminds Elizabeth over the phone that they are in fact one. Every time one of them wakes up and sees the wreckage from the night before, she blames the other body in the exact same way someone would refer to their own drunken actions after a night of partying as those of a separate person. The degree to which Elizabeth then clings to Sue's actions and acclaim and sex appeal as her own begs the question, what is the self? What parts of us do we consider the real us, the majority shareholders of our sense of being? There's a potential Freudian reading there as well. Sue representing the pleasure-seeking id, Elizabeth experiencing reality as the ego, and the faceless voice instructing her on the substance's rules over the phone as the moralistic superego. Kornblue discusses how the trend towards immediacy flattens these psychological barriers, and likewise, the course of the film tracks the slow erasure of this line. Elizabeth becomes just as indulgent as Sue, only eating and lounging instead of drinking and fucking. And as their bodies begin to deteriorate in tandem, they are in every sense except literally the same. There is, if nothing else, one hard physical barrier between them, until Sue eviscerates that line entirely by attempting to double dip on the substance, and ends up fusing their bodies together. The body itself then reflects this psychophysical conglomeration, and I imagine the maximalist filmmaking intends to reflect this as well. So again, I find it ironic that for as tapped in aesthetically as the film is to these radical modes, it falls back on a much more traditional framework. This final creature Elizabeth and Sue morph into, the monster Elizasu by the film's own nomenclature, immediately conjures images of the Brundlefly from David Cronenberg's The Fly. And this opens up the floodgates to a series of traditional cinematic influences that make up the skeletal structure of the film. The one-point perspective-y back halls of the TV studio and red and white bathroom where we meet Harvey feel lifted straight out of The Shining, which calls to mind the scene where Jack believes he's being embraced by a beautiful young woman who secretly turns out to be a disgusting old lady. The juxtaposition between these two, between the young and the old, and the horror drawn from the sight of an elderly body, is the idea the substance's entire conceit extrapolates on. It takes for granted that we've been conditioned by decades of horror films to find older bodies frightening on some level, transitioning Elizabeth from regular bodily aging processes to full-on prosthetic monstrosity in a way that highlights how horror traditions have gotten away with conflating the two, and it applies that idea to the inner workings of the film industry and society at large, the way we internalize these images. I've seen people give the movie some flack for falling into this trope itself, but I think anything body negative about the film is to be perceived as the result of this status quo, communicating a subjective experience of body dysmorphia and the various contextual factors that produce it. There are also some hints, some notes of David Lynch in there, with some very two-dimensional graphics that have no intent of looking realistic, particularly one overlaid on a doorknob, as well as the disturbing Hollywood satire of Mulholland Drive. But I think in practice, Farjah most closely operates in the framework of Terry Gilliam, whose own use of wide-angle distortion and fascination with body modification and general formal bombast in retrospect seem to form a sort of instruction manual for Farjah to follow here. She takes no measures to hide her influences, practically laying out a bibliography of her sources through music cues like a piece of Bernard Herrmann's Vertigo score or Richard Strauss's Thus Spake Zarathustra, evocative of another Kubrick film. And I guess what I'm getting at here is that, yet again, the film presents itself as this groundbreaking sensory experience, but it's so indebted to such safely tenured entries in the canon that at no point does it feel like the film is actually taking any sort of risk. It's a demonstration of what white elephant art looks like when the authoritative institutions have already embraced the risks you seem to be taking. This takes me back to Cronenberg. While it's easy to look at any body horror movie, especially one that makes it into the Cannes Film Festival, and throw it a Cronenberg comparison, especially in a year when Cronenberg himself also has a film in the festival, I do think The Substance is in far more explicit conversation with his work than most run-of-the-mill body horror efforts. This goes beyond the eerie similarities between the monster Elizasu and the Brundlefly. Look at all the anal imagery inhabiting this film, such as Elizabeth's spinal tap puncture wound, evoking the assholic video game ports of Existence. Even more explicit is the back slit Sue is birthed out of, evoking Videodrome's stomach vagina. But Farjah's thematic interests are completely different from Cronenberg's, and these parallels actually make abundantly clear how antithetical to his framework The Substance is. To Cronenberg, the body is a vessel to comment outwardly on the world at large, whereas Farjah constructs her world to comment inwardly on the body itself. Her film is about sex appeal, but decidedly not about sex, whereas Cronenberg uses sex as a means of illustrating our base desires as a species and speculating on our evolution, including the embrace of plastics and the synthetic. The most notorious mantra across his work is "Long live the new flesh." He even detests the term body horror because he's always found and celebrated transcendence in the body's embrace of new technology. The Substance, on the other hand, uses staunch horror to convey an unnerving sociological reality. Through this mode, coupled with the aforementioned sprinkles of class commentary, I would liken her approach more to that of Brandon Cronenberg than David Cronenberg, and you can hear all about that comparison in my Infinity Pool video. It's not that David Cronenberg loves the things Farja detests or vice versa, but rather that among the vast and nuanced world of plastics and body modifications, his interests lie in the areas where they improve our lives and speak to broader societal trends, whereas Farja focuses on the aspects of these fields that are eating away at us. Both spheres are valid and necessary to explore. And maybe Cronenberg's optimism stems from the fact that he is a man and therefore is not subjected to the same tribulations as Farja, but I think his framework is more universal than simply commenting on specific gendered experiences. After all, I'd say Julia Ducournau followed this sensibility of body horror for transcendence with Titane. Farja is making no sweeping statements like Cronenberg or Ducournau. She is laser-focused on this one thing, specifically tapped into the micro. For this reason, I think the film is largely incompatible with Corinne's assessment of the youth. Like Cronenberg, he's thinking about more macro trends, whereas Farja is focused on today, on people's immediate experiences. This isn't in and of itself a bad thing. I don't think she's trying to discount the next generation's contribution to art or cinema as a whole. I agree with the film's sentiment, but I believe this intended scope accounts for why the film is so incessant on bludgeoning the same point over and over again. And there's certainly value to repeating the same simple idea in various iterations. The most pretentious example that comes to mind is Ravel's Bolero, vamping the same couple of musical ideas over and over with increasing scale until it reaches a climax only made possible because of that repetition. Some ideas are simple enough to merely serve as a springboard for a variety show of set pieces, and other ideas simply bear repeating in the most blunt manner possible. I don't think the message of the substance is particularly controversial to your average viewer, but considering the stigmas that still linger around women over the age of 40 in Hollywood, coupled with a historied status quo of sexual malice on the executive level, there will never not be value to hammering Farja's point home. And aside from that, the film largely gets by on the theme park ride appeal of its various set pieces. The aforementioned ASMR stuff, the design of the final monster, and even smaller bits like when the TV studio crew goes back and closely scrutinizes the sped up footage of Sue twerking on the show. There's a ton of great individual moments throughout, just by virtue of throwing everything to the wall. But the movie keeps going and going, with a sustained third act and bloated runtime for the scope of the narrative, and ironically, this idea of harping on the same note feels formally aligned with the overcompensation and self-mutilation Elizabeth performs. There's a scene where she has a date lined up with a childhood classmate, as he seems to be the only man who finds the real her attractive. But she keeps catching glimpses of Sue and deciding to undo and redo her makeup over and over again, more aggressively each time as the clock ticks and she ultimately misses the date. Similarly, the film never seems quite satisfied with its climactic set pieces and seeks to up the ante in each next scene. Eventually, it becomes exhausting. What starts out as beauty in the simplicity quickly becomes frustratingly one note. What starts out as intentionally on the nose quickly becomes a series of low-hanging fruit so over the top that it almost swings back around, but doesn't quite. What starts out as an idea so self-evident it can be communicated in a self-contained prologue quickly reveals itself as a movie about metamorphosis, itself never developing or changing. At a certain point, it begins to feel like Farja simply doesn't trust her audience, like she's operating in the language of Adam McKay's Don't Look Up, where things have to be communicated in the most condescending manner to get the point across. Granted, when everyone in her world is a doofus, it's hard to expect anything else. But that doesn't account for the sheer number of times she flashes back to her own foreshadowing, as is the case with the line, "She'd be more beautiful with a boob in the middle of her face instead of that nose," or "Everything seems to be in the right place." When these pay off later in the film, she makes sure we know it. Even more egregious is when Elizabeth encounters the older body of the young nurse who introduced her to the substance. In his earlier scene, it's heavily emphasized that he has a birthmark, but when Elizabeth sees the old man's birthmark, we're still treated to a flashback in case that went over our heads, followed by like 3 other flashbacks in quick succession. Or take the number of clever visual parallels she sets up and then completely deflates by making unmistakably apparent in the edit, such as the back zipper Sue wears on one of her nights out. In case we didn't get the body horror reference, we're treated to rapid cutting back to Elizabeth's back wound and a full-blown hallucination of Sue's guts spilling out of the zipper. And this is just the first of many fake-out dream sequences, when the film teases really going off the rails and then immediately dials it back. Part of all this simply has to do with the maximalist nature of the film and that sensory overload approach, but it begins to feel like the film insists on doing everything for us and leaves little in the way of active engagement. So the net result is that rather than posing an endurance test, the film just causes us to mentally check out, to stop caring in the first place. And why shouldn't we when the film is so caked in irony? This calls to mind another bloated, quote-unquote art film operating in the Adult Swim language, Beau is Afraid. Like Ari Aster's film, The Substance's biggest crime is the sheer assurance it has in its own provocation. One of its gimmicks is the fact that the text the Substance procedure uses is the same font as the film's credits, so in lieu of an opening title card, we're presented a thumb drive that diegetically says The Substance. And I actually think this is a pretty clever design idea, as it drives home just how heavy-handed the film is, clearly speaking directly to the audience. In other words, eliminating mediation. But toward the end of the film, when Elizabeth decides to cancel the service, she receives a note that says, again, in the same font as the film's credits, "We're sorry you were disappointed by your experience with The Substance." And again, I think the joke is clever in a vacuum with good comedic timing, but I'm just so wary of any film that not only preempts its own criticism during its runtime, but seems to invite it and even relish in it. The Beau is Afraid equivalent would be its final shot, in which a booing audience walks out of the auditorium as the credits roll. I'm fine with the film's marketing using actual bad reviews to advertise itself, but when this, "oh, I bet you're mad" attitude makes its way into the content of the film itself, it just brings with it such an air of self-consciousness that it deflates any of the aspects that were actually provocative. And look, maybe a self-conscious mode is the only way to tell a story about self-consciousness. Ultimately, the tension I've been discussing between the film's younger and older formal instincts, its attempts to engage with the Gen Z TikTok attention economy and pave a future for the medium by means of such an old-school traditional narrative framework, is a fascinating meeting or battle of form and function. But if the point Farjah is trying to prove is that there is still value and beauty to older things, then the mixed results she achieves in trying to prove it here not only lead her to shoot herself in the foot, but to gnaw it off entirely. That's it for me this time around on The Substance. Like, share, comment, subscribe. You know what to do. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Go over to patreon.com and get some exclusive bonus content. We're coming up on 9 months of Patreon exclusive reviews. I think our most recent was, we covered some Peter Greenaway. If that's your jam, you should go over there and check that out. Until then, I'm Taylor J. Williams, reporting for Aura Cybersecurity. Click the link in the description below. All right, have a good one. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.